Welcome to this special report on C-Soup Radio. Now introducing award-winning investigative reporter Judd McIlvain.
This interview is based on the true stories of the last surviving member of a three-member CIA contract team known as the 231 Club. These three covert soldiers followed orders which sent them around the world to deliver weapons, money, train American allies, and sometimes eliminate its enemies. For the first time ever, a contract killer for the CIA speaks out about his assignments and the loyalty and love he had for his country and his team members. Now, some of the dates and names and places have been changed in order to protect those who were his associates and the family members who are still alive. And his team called him Cowboy because of a nickname he picked up in an Arab country. According to my calculations here, it was 15 years ago that you quit the 231 Club. Why are you speaking out now?
Well, there's a few reasons why. I mean, when we first started the 231 Club, we decided that there wasn't any reason for anyone else to know about it except for our government contact. I mean,
that makes sense.
Yeah. Well, you want to protect your families, you want to protect your associates, and we felt that the last surviving member could tell the story if needed and would also make the decision on when that should be done. And there's a lot of negative things being said about the CIA, a lot of negative things about the intelligence agencies as a whole doing terrible work, and they do a lot of good work. I mean, if the government hadn't cut back on all the expenses over the years, you might have enough people out there to do the job in gathering the proper information.
Okay, now, but tell me about these guys that worked with you.
Well, there was Chauncey Holt. He was a very multi-talented individual. He started working in Black Ops in the early 50s, and later there was a program called the Executive Action, which was basically dealing with the elimination of foreign leaders.
You mean going overseas and killing foreign leaders?
Yes, that's true. In fact, it became very controversial. Then there was Michael Harries. Michael Harries was a great resource when it came to tactics and weapons training. Michael was also the man, by the way, that developed the Harries flashlight technique that is used all over the world by police agencies.
All cops know that. I learned that in the academies, where you hold the flashlight and you put the gun right above it.
Yes.
You can see your target perfectly in the dark.
Yes, exactly. And by the way, I was working as a psychological consultant when all this began, specializing in subconscious conditioning, pain control, overall behavior modification.
Okay, before we get into more details about these two other men, tell me a little bit about what the government wanted you to do when you traveled around.
My first assignment, going back to the beginning, was as a courier.
And you screwed that one up, right?
Well, that didn't go down very well. So that's when he introduced me to Michael Harries. And Michael Harries started training me. Well, I became very good at weapons and tactics. They felt, instead of just doing document work, that maybe I could go on to other areas, dealing with other activities, I should say.
Tell me about this first assignment.
Michael and I were in Europe. It's on the second day. We were in the hotel. He's sitting there whittling on a chopstick, putting a little groove on the chopstick.
You mean a wooden chopstick like you eat food with?
Yeah, exactly. Any type of chopstick that you normally... Well, of course, in some restaurants now they're plastic. But anyway, we're at this Asian restaurant later that night. We sit down. I want you to concentrate solely on that individual. I said, okay. A few minutes later, the gentleman's starting to walk out of the restaurant. As he's passing the table, there's this big commotion of dishes dropping. Everybody's looking towards the sound of the dishes. At that time, the man passing with the chopstick stabs the man seated at that table and continues walking right out of the restaurant. Michael says to me, "Let's go." So we leave, we get back to the hotel, and now he reviews everything that happened. And that's when he tells me why he was carving the groove around the chopstick. That was because when the man was stabbed with the chopstick, the man stabbing him could break off the end of it so that nothing was sticking out of the man's chest.
So they thought he was having a heart attack.
Exactly.
And nobody saw the stabbing because everybody was looking at all the dishes being dumped on the floor.
Exactly. Leaving the wood in the wound, Michael explained, would also cause less bleeding, so that it would be less noticeable as far as what happened.
But how did you feel about seeing your first killing right up close and personal, right in front of you? You knew somebody was going to be killed that night, and you saw it happen.
Well, I probably felt like any soldier would feel on the battlefield, seeing the enemy being killed. Now, this wasn't on a traditional battlefield, but it's basically the same thing. Here's an enemy of our country. There were orders that were given to eliminate this enemy. I felt that the right thing was being done.
We're sent to Latin America to kill another foreign leader who apparently was a problem to the United States government because he was standing in the way of developing democracy for the small country that he was in. Tell me about what happened there.
Well, first of all, we didn't go in to eliminate the leader of a foreign country. This was a man that was in a local government outside of El Salvador, and he was using tactics of torture and killings to get his way. And he needed to be kicked out of the club.
Oh, whoa. What do you mean kicked out of the club?
You have to understand that when the 231 Club was first formed, it was formed so that we could speak in a language that other people really wouldn't know what we were talking about. For example, if we mentioned that someone was going to be kicked out of the club, they were somebody that was going to be eliminated. If we were talking about going to shoot pool and make sure you bring your pool cue was a rifle. A handgun was a wallet. So this was our way of being able to discuss things without anyone really knowing what we were talking about.
So it was your code, that's all.
Exactly. It was a language, our own language.
Do you think that everybody or a lot of people in this world are evil and should be eliminated?
Well, this particular person, it was felt, should be eliminated. This was a real brain twister because the guy lived on top of a hill and he always had somebody start his car before driving. And it was very difficult because the car was very well armored. It had bulletproof glass. It had steel panels in the doors. So we had to find a way to be able to get this guy. So
he
Michael
apparently knew there would be people looking to kill him.
Oh, yes.
He was well prepared for that.
That was obvious. What happened was that Michael came up with a great idea. And the idea was to build a little gas chamber inside the car.
On some documentation I found while doing research here, it pointed out that you had 11 confirmed kills at that time, and that would be several, almost 20 years ago. Do those memories haunt you? I mean, can you sleep at night?
In the first few months, yeah, it was very difficult. I would see those faces of people from time to time in dreams and during the day or wherever they would pop up. But after a while, you begin to realize that you're doing a job. And like any soldier, you're doing the job for a purpose, and I believed in the purpose.
To answer a question in my mind, what does a young man from a small California town do to get connected with the CIA and a contract killing team? How'd that work?
Well, Chauncey and I met at one of my lectures in, I think it was UCLA. And I would do lectures from time to time about pain control, subconscious conditioning, things on...
Well, what was your educational background that you do lectures like that?
Well, I started out as a hypnotherapist. I then moved on to my own process. I got a bachelor's degree in psychology, a master's degree in psychology. I was state licensed as a family therapist. So that's basically the educational background. But it started long before that with my curiosity of the mind and how it worked. But because of this lecture, Chauncey and I met. And he was very interested in this subject matter, and we became friends. And after a few months, he asked me about joining him in doing different assignments for our government. And it was, simple documents I could pick up in other countries, and or deliver to other countries.
Did he tell you up front that they also eliminated people?
No. All I knew that it was basically shuffling documents back and forth.
Okay, tell me a little bit more about the background of Chauncey and Michael in this 231 Club.
Chauncey Holt. Now, Chauncey had a very interesting past. He came from the Alleghenies of Kentucky. He was very violent at that time. While he went to grammar school, he was carrying a .45. I mean, it was very violent, even for the children. About the age of 10 or 12, he started High Wire Act because one of his relatives owned what they called a mud circus. He later started training with a man that would do stunt work with aircraft, and he was doing wind walking.
How about wing
walking, excuse me. And the guy would teach him in exchange how to fly an airplane. Later on, he got into some trouble, Chauncey. After joining the Air Corps, Army Air Corps, he ended up in prison where he met some people that were very well connected to the what we would call the mob. And later ended up working with Meyer Lansky. He was a fine artist, which led him into becoming one of the best forgers around. Michael was, as I said, a Marine. Michael was trained in the 50s with machine guns, explosives, handguns, just many different types of weapons, and was just great when it came to tactics. He was always there for you. Anytime you needed Michael, all you had to do is pick up the phone and call, and you would never hear him say, well, what's it about? He would always say, I'm on my way, and he would be there for you. So it was, those two men were, you couldn't ask for better when it came to partners, especially when you're putting your life on the line.
Obviously, you couldn't tell your relatives, your family members, or people outside this 231 Club what you did for a living. How do you feel about lying to people that you care about?
Well, it was very difficult, of course. I mean, how would anyone feel having to look somebody that you care about in the eyes and make up stories about where you were going, what you were doing? So I felt like anyone would feel. I felt lousy about it, but I knew it was something I had to do. I mean, that was the job. What are you going to do? Put them in jeopardy? I don't think so.
Well, now, a lot of organizations have a code of ethics.
Well, we did. There were certain rules. There were certain, certain guidelines in how you would behave. There was something called LTF. LTF meant loyalty. You were always loyal to your country, team members, to the associates that you had to work with. There was also T for trust. You always trusted in your partners that they would always be there so that you could feel confident in getting the job done. Now, there is a certain amount of nervousness going into a job, but you don't want it to be overabundant. You want a little nervousness which keeps your sight, your hearing, and all your senses sharp. Then there was F for focus. You always focused more than 100% on preparing for the assignment and during the assignment. You never thought about anything else. You always left everything else back home. There was one rule that was called the 24-hour rule. This was a favorite of Michael's especially. And the rule was that if you did something fantastic, you did something you wanted to brag about, you could brag about all day long for 24 hours. And if you did something that you were ashamed of, you failed at, then you had 24 hours to cry about it. And
then you sucked it up and you went on.
Exactly.
I understand some of this violence overseas has actually followed you back to Los Angeles. And there was a gun battle in the high desert that you were involved in. In fact, they almost killed you in that.
And at that time, I was doing a lot of lectures, so it wasn't unusual for someone to call and set me up for a lecture. Well, in this particular case, I really was set up. And
it wasn't a lecture?
No. We got a call in. One of the secretaries took the call and set up a lecture for me to speak in front of a group of doctors in Las Vegas. And they asked if I was going to drive, and I always like to drive rather than fly. So they asked me if I could pick up someone in Barstow, which was on the way. So I'd have to go through the desert in order to get there. and I left about 9 o'clock.
You had no idea someone would be waiting in the desert for you?
No. In fact, they weren't waiting. They were following me. After about, 45 minutes to an hour, I kept noticing this car behind me. And it would speed up when I would, and it would slow down when I would. So when I got into the desert past Little Rock, I decided to test it, and I saw a paved road off to the side. So I quickly took the paved road, and sure enough, they're right behind me. So I knew this road was probably just going further and further into the desert. So what I did was I just slammed on the brakes and drove the car into a sandbank and threw it in park. Got out, started to get out as their car had to swerve around me and stopped about, 10, 15 yards ahead of me.
To keep from hitting your car that just
exactly
dove into the bank.
Well, I drove into the bank, and they stopped on the pavement about 10, 15 yards ahead of me.
Now, I'm looking at official Los Angeles County Sheriff's pictures right now. I have in my hand, and your car is full of bullet holes. Yeah, I count 20 more or so.
Well, they said there was about 26 hits in the car. They said they were probably using shotguns with double-aught buck and 44 mag because of the slugs.
I was going to say, those holes up there by that door looked like they'd be 44.
Yeah.
They're not shotgun.
Yeah.
So there must have been a heck of a firefight.
Well, what happened was when they stopped in front of me, I started to get out of the car, and when I saw the doors open and about 4 or 5 guys in the car with guns, I stood up behind my door, which was now open, and started firing shots at them. I fired off a couple of shots into the chest of one of the men in the rear seat, and then I fired a headshot at one in the passenger side as he was getting out.
I'm looking at all the shooting awards that you've gotten and all the trophies. You must be a pretty good shot.
Michael had me join a shooting club in order to hone my skills.
Okay, back to the shootout now. What happened?
Well, as I said, I fired off those shots, and then I started to head back to the rear of the car to get better cover, and then that's when they started firing. I popped up, fired a couple of more shots in their direction, and then took off into the desert, where they kept firing at me.
So you just ran off into the desert. I know the area well, and there's nothing but desert there.
Yeah, especially at that time. Little Rock only had about 4 buildings. Of course, now I think after all these years it has maybe 6. But
that's true.
Well, I took off in the desert, and I'm wearing dress shoes, a dress shirt, and dress pants, so it was pretty cold out there. So I tried to keep warm as well as I could, but I just kept moving back towards what I thought was Little Rock. I didn't get onto the main road because I thought, well, they might be still out there. So I just kept on. And
did you have any idea who these guys were?
No idea.
Now, did you report that? Well, you must have reported to the sheriff's office. I'm looking at the official sheriff's pictures here.
Well, I finally made it back to Little Rock, and the last part of it was through a rock quarry, which I don't suggest anyone try in dress shoes, but I did finally get back. And there was some concern. I had some concern because it was getting pretty hot the next day, and I didn't have any water. So I finally make it back to a little cafe, called the sheriff's department, and they told me they were just about ready to send out a search party because they found my car still running. This is what amazed me. It was still running the next day with the lights still on. When I asked them about did they find anybody, they said no, and I didn't expect that they would.
They didn't even find the 2 people you hit?
No. Professionals would have taken the car and the bodies, so I didn't expect really for them to find anything. There was a bunch of blood, but I don't know. And we never found out who it was. But it was shortly after I started working with the King of Morocco and started also doing some courier work. So,
some people would call your partners just everyday killers. Do you consider that they're killers or they're soldiers, they're heroes for what they did for the United States?
First of all, the word hero has been misused so much, to me it doesn't even hardly mean anything. Everybody is a hero. They save a cat out of a tree, they're a hero. police officers who I respect tremendously and firemen, if they do something that jeopardizes their life when they don't have to save somebody else, to me that's a hero. Just being a police officer or being a fireman or doing any other kind of work is just somebody that's getting paid to do a job. So a hero is somebody that actually puts their life on the line. Michael and Chauncey were heroes, definitely.
Were you a hero too?
That would really be lame for me to say one way or the other.
You're the last member standing.
I'd rather not even think in those terms.
Okay,
as far as myself.
Let's change the subject a little bit. What type of equipment did you use on these assignments? I mean, we've seen in the movies James Bond with laser guns, laser watches. He had everything you could think of. Did you all have equipment like that?
We wish we would have had equipment like that. Sometimes we would get maybe a little help with a vehicle or something, but it was mainly what we could muster up ourselves. We would basically use the Colt 45 semi-automatic. We would use rifles like the M1A. I had a favorite rifle, which was a H&K 91. Of course, Michael hated it because it wasn't an American rifle, but it had a sweet sniper trigger set up on it. It was beautiful. But we had to be very creative. Now, what I did, because I was utilized also for my expertise in behavior, being able to spot people, judge their behavior, but there were other things I did. I personally took some acting classes, some lessons in improv, so that I'd be more spontaneous on assignment. May sound funny, but it worked out very well.
Were you surprised at what people would believe?
Oh,
I mean, you tell them something and they just believe it.
I'm never surprised. If you approach somebody with the right suggestion, it will work if you understand their behavior. For example, you can say to two women, "You look beautiful today." One takes it literally and says, "Thank you very much." The other one picks up an inference and says, "Well, what was wrong with me yesterday?" So by understanding, some people take things literally, some people work more on what they think you're saying, that gives you information that allows you now to approach that individual in a way that they're going to be much more susceptible.
I'm curious what you think about the Iraqi war, how it's been handled, and what's happened to the CIA's reputation during the war.
I started working in Arab countries in the late 70s. And I have kept contacts with a lot of those people, very high-ranking people, for over 20-some years. And my intel was that there were no weapons of mass destruction, that most of the people knew it over there. And the problem with the war basically was everyone knew that they were going to just roll over Iraq's so-called army. But the problem was what they were going to do afterwards. The plan of going into a country that has had thousands and thousands of years of one kind of mindset and saying, oh, all of a sudden we're going to have democracy, it was known by many to be a ridiculous plan because there was no plan. And now to pull out at this particular time is bad, but staying in there is just as bad.
Since you have worked for the CIA, what do you think about Homeland Security? Do you think it's really going to secure the United States?
I think it's been a horrible, terrible mess. When Tom Ridge came out with his color scheme of threats, I think it was 2 decades ago, Jeff Cooper came out with a handbook that talked about colors of threat. And this was very useful for a person to utilize in order to increase his awareness of his surroundings. For example, you're walking down the street. Everything is fine, so the feeling is green. You all of a sudden start seeing somebody coming from the other direction towards you. They're wearing a trench coat. They look a little funny. So now you think, well, maybe the threat level is yellow. It's keeping your awareness at a higher level now of your surroundings. Now the person's getting a little closer. They slide their hand into their coat. They look suspicious. Now the threat goes up to orange. So this is what it was made for, the individual, to have a whole nation trying to use this concept in how they should feel or act is absolutely ridiculous.
Does it mean something for New York, and does it mean the same thing for Coffeyville, Kansas?
Exactly. And that's what, I'm glad you brought that up, because there have been how many billions of dollars spent? I mean, $280 billion, something along that, spent for Homeland Security, and a lot of these little places that are no threat at all are spending the money on air conditioning for their tractors or their vehicles. I mean, what is that about? The money should be spent where it's really needed the most. How about guarding our nuclear plants? And then they spend, $180 million on natural catastrophes. And what happens with New Orleans?
But then on the other side of the issue, the officials will point out we haven't had another terrorist attack since 9/11.
Well, if they think it's because of what we've done in Homeland Security, they are very, very mistaken.
Thank you very much for taking the time to speak out and tell us this amazing story. I'm Judd McIlvain, the troubleshooter, and you've been listening to a special report. Thank you again for listening.